stranded on a remote island and facing nature's cruelest tests. What would you do if civilization vanished and only your will to survive remained? Today, we're diving into 3 incredible true stories of Americans who were stranded on U.S. islands. These are the stories of Philip Ashton, who escaped brutal pirates only to face 16 months alone in a bug-infested Caribbean jungle. Deborah Scaling Kiley, who watched sharks devour her crewmates while drifting in blood-stained waters off the Atlantic coast. And Steven Callahan, who talked to his life raft for 76 days while slowly dying in the endless ocean. Each of these survivors battled complete isolation, hostile environments, and the terrifying breakdown of their own minds. Prepare yourself for an adventure that reveals the darkest truths about human survival. Where are you watching from today? Would you mind sharing a mystery that happened in your location? I'll be going through the comments. Your story might be featured in our next video. Our journey begins in 1723. The Caribbean was crawling with pirates, and Philip Ashton, he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Ashton wasn't a pirate. He was just a 20-year-old fisherman from Massachusetts who got captured by one of the most brutal pirates in history, Edward Lowe. And Lowe? He was the kind of man who would torture you for hours, just for fun. He once cut off a Portuguese captain's lips, cooked them, and forced the guy to eat them while they were still warm. But here's where it gets insane. Ashton was on the pirate ship for months, watching them torture and murder innocent people. This made him scared, and the only thought that rang in his head was to escape. When Lowe's crew stopped at Roten Island for water, Ashton saw his chance. He slipped away into the jungle, but he had no idea what was waiting for him. He had no shoes, no tools, and no food. Just a bug-infested jungle filled with wild boars that could gore him to death, sharks circling the beaches, and insects that could eat him alive. On the first day, he was already bleeding. The coral and rocks on that beach had torn his feet to shreds, and by nightfall, his feet looked like raw meat. On the second day, the insects found him. They were not mosquitoes. Roten Island had these biting flies that can inflict painful bites. These were the insects that came for him. The insects alone nearly drove him insane. Clouds of insects that turned his skin into a battlefield, ants that would strip flesh from bone, and spiders the size of dinner plates. But the insects were nothing compared to what was hunting him. Wild boars. Massive, tusked killing machines that could gore a man in seconds. Whenever he encountered them, he would run and climb trees. For 16 months, Philip Ashton lived like a terrified monkey, scrambling up whatever tree was closest every time he heard rustling in the jungle. His hands were shredded, and his feet were cut to ribbons, but he was alive. Then there were the sharks. Ashton had to fish. He had to wade into the shallows to spear fish or catch crabs. And every single time he entered that water, he was gambling with his life. Caribbean reef sharks don't mess around. They're not the massive great whites you see in movies, but they're aggressive, territorial, and they smell blood from miles away. Ashton's feet were constantly bleeding from coral cuts from walking barefoot on jagged rocks, and every step into that water was like ringing a dinner bell. For the first few weeks, Ashton survived on turtle eggs he found on the beach. Raw, slimy, and disgusting, but it was protein and he ate them anyway, gagging with every swallow. When those ran out, he tried eating grass, then tree bark. His stomach cramped so badly he could barely walk. His body was covered in infected insect bites. And every night he could hear the sounds of wild animals getting closer. But then winter came. And in the Caribbean, winter means everything dies. The turtle eggs disappeared. The fruit rotted. Ashton was starving, and his body started eating itself. He lost so much weight that he could barely stand. And that's when he started hearing voices. His mind was breaking. He would have conversations with people who weren't there. He'd see rescue ships that were just hallucinations. And for months, he lived in this nightmare between reality and madness. He tried to kill himself, found some poisonous berries and ate a handful. But his stomach was so empty, he just vomited them back up. He couldn't even die properly. Then something incredible happened. In the 9th month of his escape, another castaway showed up. An Englishman whom a different pirate crew had marooned. This man had tools. He had a knife and some rope, and for the first time in months, Ashton wasn't alone. They worked together for 3 months, built a better shelter, and caught some fish. And for the first time since escaping, Ashton thought he might actually survive this. Then, suddenly, the Englishman disappeared. One morning, Ashton woke up and the guy was just gone. His tools were still there. There was no sign of a struggle. No goodbye note. He just vanished. To this day, nobody knows what happened to him. Did he drown trying to fish? Did a boar get him? Did he go crazy and walk into the ocean? Ashton never found out. But those tools, that knife and those fishing hooks, saved his life. Without them, he would have died within weeks of the stranger's disappearance. So now he's alone again. But this time it was worse. Because now he knows what it feels like to have hope and lose it. Months 15 and 16 were the darkest. Ashton's journals described him as a walking skeleton covered in scars. His hair had turned white. He looked like a ghost. But then, after 16 months of pure hell, something impossible happened. January 1725. 16 months after escaping into that jungle, a ship appeared. A real ship. When they pulled him aboard, the crew literally didn't believe he was human. They thought he was some kind of island spirit. The captain wrote in his log that Ashton looked more dead than alive. He looked scarred and traumatized, but he was alive. When Ashton returned to Boston, he published his story that same year. Ashton's Memorial. Everyone called him a liar. They said it was just another Robinson Crusoe knockoff. Even his own neighbors didn't believe him. Because the truth was inconvenient. Philip Ashton's story raised uncomfortable questions. How does an entire pirate ship just lose track of one prisoner? Why did no rescue missions search for castaways in known pirate hideouts? But here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold. It took historians 300 years to verify the details of his account. The weather patterns, the island's geography, and even the pirate crew records. Everything checked out. Philip Ashton really did survive 16 months alone on that island. And when you realize that's true, the other stories I'm about to tell you become even more terrifying. Real talk. If you're watching a video about someone who survived 16 months of hell and you can't survive clicking a subscribe button, that's actually concerning. Like, Ashton fought wild boars with his bare hands, and you're scared of a little red button? Come on. Subscribe, or go tell everyone in the comments why you're more fragile than a guy eating raw turtle eggs. Our next story took place in October 1982. Off the coast of North Carolina, 5 people are about to experience a nightmare that makes Philip Ashton's ordeal look like a camping trip. 5 people board a yacht called Trashman for what should be a routine sailing trip from Maryland to Florida. This isn't some rickety old merchant vessel or a tiny fishing boat. This is a modern sailing yacht, equipped with all the latest safety gear, operated by experienced crew members. Deborah Scaling Kiley thought it would be easy money. She was an experienced sailor, and this was just supposed to be a quick delivery job. But as they sailed into the night, everything went wrong. A massive storm hit without warning. That storm came out of nowhere. The weather service didn't even predict it. One minute they were sailing in choppy water, and the next minute they were getting hit by 40-foot waves. The mast snapped first, like a toothpick. Then the hull started cracking. Water poured in faster than they could pump it out. In less than an hour, the Trashman was sinking. Deborah later described those final minutes as controlled chaos. Everyone knew they were going down. The question was whether they'd make it to the life raft before the boat took them with it. They had maybe 10 minutes from "we might be in trouble" to "abandon ship or die." 5 people. One tiny life raft. and they were 60 miles from shore in shark-infested waters. They thought the Coast Guard would come, but they never came. They had the coordinates, they had the Mayday call, and they knew exactly where to look, but for reasons nobody has ever explained, they just stopped looking. They left 5 people floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with no rescue coming. And that's when things got horrifying. The first to break were the men. Mark and John started drinking seawater despite Deborah's desperate warnings. She knew what would happen, and she watched in horror as their minds unraveled. Mark started talking to people who weren't there. He thought he was at a bar. He kept asking for cigarettes. And then, on the second day, he jumped overboard. He told them he was going to get cigarettes, as if the corner store was just a swim away. The others screamed for him to come back, but he was already in the water, swimming away, talking to himself, and completely delusional. That's when the sharks came, and they took him before he could even scream. Deborah watched in absolute terror as Mark disappeared beneath the surface in a churning mass of blood and fins. The water around their raft turned red, and chunks of things floated to the surface. But it got worse. John, seeing his friend die, completely lost his mind. The next day, the same delusion claimed him. Cigarettes. Both of them died believing they were going shopping for cigarettes. Now it was just 3 women on that raft. Deborah, Meg, and another survivor were floating in water that was literally stained with their friend's blood. And those sharks? They didn't leave. They followed the raft, waiting for the next person to fall in. Meg's death was different. Slower, more agonizing. She'd been injured when the boat went down, gashes on her legs that became infected in the salt water. By the 4th day, the wounds were festering, green and black with gangrene. The smell was so bad that Deborah and Brad had to force themselves not to vomit. Meg started hallucinating too, but her visions were darker. She saw her dead mother calling to her from the water. She saw angels and demons fighting over her soul. She begged Deborah to push her overboard to end her suffering. And here's the part that haunts Deborah to this day. She considered it. For hours, she sat there looking at her dying friend and seriously considered mercy killing her. On the 5th day, Meg died. They gave her a funeral at sea when she finally passed. Then they faced what many survivors of extreme situations always face: cannibalism. Deborah sat in this tiny raft with Meg's corpse, surrounded by sharks, with no rescue coming. She was faced with the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Should she eat her friend to survive? She couldn't do it. Physically, mentally, and morally, she just couldn't. So they wrapped Meg in a tarp and pushed her into the ocean. Watched her sink into the same water where Mark and John had died. For 3 more days, Deborah floated alone with Bradshaw. They were surrounded by sharks, waiting to die. Their skin was burning off, and their lips were cracked and bleeding. They were going insane from thirst. Deborah later said she started planning her own suicide, because watching sharks eat you alive seemed better than slowly dying of thirst. And that's when, after 8 days in hell, a Russian-Soviet trawler named K spotted them. The crew thought they were looking at corpses until Deborah weakly waved her hand. The crew quickly helped them. When they came back and Deborah told her story, some people didn't believe her. They said the shark attacks were exaggerated. They questioned the timeline. They wondered if she was making it up for attention. But here's what they couldn't explain. Where were Mark and John's bodies? Where was Meg? And why did 2 survivors come back traumatized in ways that you just can't fake? They survived. But at what cost? But if you think those stories are disturbing, wait until you hear about Steven Callahan. It was February 1982. The same year as the Trashman disaster. But this time, we're talking about one man, alone on the Atlantic Ocean, facing an ordeal that would last 76 days. Steven Callahan was living the dream. Solo sailing across the Atlantic in his 23-foot catamaran, Napoleon Solo. He was an experienced sailor and an accomplished boat designer. He thought he had everything under control. But he was wrong. 7 days into his journey, something slammed into his boat in the middle of the night. Steven never found out what it was. Could have been a whale. It could have been a shipping container floating just under the surface or debris from another wreck. All he knew was that his boat was taking on water fast. Within minutes, the Napoleon Solo was sinking, and Steven was scrambling to get his emergency gear into a tiny life raft. There was no GPS or radio. It was just him, a few basic supplies, and the endless Atlantic Ocean. 6 feet by 4 feet. That was his new home. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The nearest land was about 800 miles away. But here's where Steven's story gets interesting. Unlike Philip Ashton or the Trashman survivors, Steven documented everything. Every day for 76 days, he wrote in his journal. For 76 days, Steven drifted nearly 1,800 miles across the Atlantic. He created a solar still to make fresh water from seawater. He learned to spearfish with a makeshift weapon. He fought off sharks that tried to destroy his raft. But the real enemy wasn't the sharks or the starvation. It was his mind. Day after day, week after week, with nothing but empty ocean in every direction, Steven started to crack. He had conversations with his raft, naming it and talking to it like a person. He hallucinated rescue ships, and he considered suicide multiple times. His body was eating itself, his skin was covered in salt sores, and his hands were destroyed from handling fishing line. And every day, he wrote in his journal, documenting his slow descent into madness. But the worst part was the false hope. Multiple times, Steven saw ships on the horizon. He would fire his flares, wave his orange sleeping bag, and scream until his voice was gone, and watch the ships disappear. Their crews never saw his tiny raft in the vast ocean. Can you imagine? Being so close to rescue, so close to life, and watching it slip away? Again and again and again? On day 76, Caribbean fishermen finally spotted him near the island of Marigalante. When they pulled him aboard, Steven was barely human. He weighed about 30 pounds less than when he started. He was skeletal, covered in sores, and mentally shattered. But here's what bothers survival experts about Steven's story. How did he really survive? His documented fish catches don't add up to the calories needed, and his water intake calculations seem optimistic. But here's the thing. Steven Callahan spent over 2 months alone on the Atlantic Ocean, and that level of isolation, it changes you forever. Steven wrote a book about his experience. It is titled Adrift, and it became a bestseller. He also gave lectures about survival psychology. But in interviews years later, you can see it in his eyes. That same haunted look that all these survivors have. The look of someone who's seen what happens when civilization disappears and you're left with just yourself. These are 3 incredible survival stories. But here's what baffles so many people about these cases. Why didn't people believe them? Philip Ashton came back after 16 months in hell, and people called him a liar. The Trashman survivors lost 3 friends to sharks, and experts questioned their timeline. Steven Callahan drifted for over 2 months, and people wondered if he was exaggerating. And I think I know why. These stories force us to confront something terrifying about human nature. They show us that when everything is stripped away, when civilization disappears, we're just animals trying not to die. Philip Ashton ate raw turtle eggs and talked to hallucinations. Deborah Kiley watched her friends get eaten by sharks and considered cannibalism. Steven Callahan spoke to his life raft like it was his best friend. And the most disturbing part? These are the ones who survived. How many others were stranded and didn't make it? How many Philip Ashtons died alone in jungles? How many Deborahs were pulled under by sharks? How many Stevens drifted until there was nothing left but bones and an empty raft? We don't want to believe these stories because they force us to confront a horrible truth. We're all just a few days without food and water away from becoming something we don't recognize. These aren't just survival stories. They're stories about what it costs to be human when humanity is tested to its absolute limits. Thanks for watching. If this video made you think, If it made you uncomfortable, if it made you realize something about yourself, then it is worth sharing. I hope you understand why this channel exists and why your subscription matters more than you might think. So go ahead, like and subscribe for more amazing videos. Stay safe out there. And remember, civilization is thinner than you think.